With the rise of artificial intelligence and the use of neural nets to improve autonomous vehicle capabilities, it will be safety that ultimately determines whether these vehicles will be allowed on our roadways. My name's Tim Burrows, and it's my pleasure to host this May 2024 episode of Canada Talks Electric Cars, brought to you by Electric Vehicle Society. EV Society is a not-for-profit organization made up of volunteers helping to advance the transition to clean and sustainable transportation. Visit evsociety.ca to find out more and maybe to join. A warm welcome to our regular viewers and to many joining us for the first time. The topic and of course today's amazing presenter have attracted viewers not only from Canada and the United States, but also Germany, Greece, India, Norway, Portugal, Romania, Australia, and Sweden. Thank you all for choosing to spend this time with us. Despite various pronouncements and hype over the years of the inevitability that autonomous vehicles will or won't ever be safe, nobody actually knows how their safety will evolve. Beyond that, practical safety will require going far beyond the usual metric of whether a robotaxi is safer than an average human driver. Today, Professor Philip Koopman joins us to talk about how robotaxi incidents over the past years have illustrated the need to expand our view of safety, and which aspects of safety urgently need attention for the industry to succeed. Professor Koopman is an internationally recognized expert on autonomous vehicle safety. His pioneering research includes software robustness testing and runtime monitoring of autonomous systems to identify how they break and, perhaps more importantly, how to fix them. Philip Koopman is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who has been working on self-driving car safety for more than 25 years. It's now my sincere pleasure to welcome Philip to the webinar.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate being here. Just as a warm-up, this talk is mostly about robotaxis, but not entirely. I know there's more to electric vehicles than that, and so certainly we can talk about systems that cooperate with the human driver in the Q&A, but I think the definitions of safety actually apply to both. So I welcome that conversation, and let me share my slides, and we'll take it away here. Okay, are you seeing my screen?
We are.
Okay, excellent. Let me get rolling then. Okay, hi everyone. Indeed, I've been working on self-driving car safety for more than 25 years at Carnegie Mellon University. Lots of folks find it surprising that self-driving cars existed, but maybe we'll tell a story in the Q&A about that. For this talk, I'm going to talk about autonomous vehicle safety and that it's more than net risk. So let me start by asking actually a serious question. What do you mean by safe? It turns out that if you ask 7 people what safety means, you'll get 7 answers. If there's engineers in the room, you might get 8, 9, or 10. Everyone means something different by safety. And this is not an exhaustive list, but the kind of things you hear is you hear some rhetoric. Safety is our #1 priority, and robotaxis won't make stupid driving mistakes, therefore they'll be safer than humans. And both of those turn out to be rhetoric. We're going to see why that is. But the people making them say you should believe we're safe because of these things. There are things that are acceptable net risk. There's a thing especially popular in Europe called positive risk balance. It explain what that means, but it basically means safer than a human. Or people will say, well, I managed to buy insurance, so I must be safe. Not really, because you can buy expensive insurance and not necessarily be as safe as you really want to be. And there's people who say, you know, there's more to safety than safer than a human. There's things like inequities and negligent driving behavior and engineering rigor. And so this talk, I'm going to warm up by talking about robotaxis, but I'm going to revisit all these topics as we go through to try and sort of expand the horizons for what it means to be safe in the real world. And I'm not going digging here for weird stuff. This is all stuff that when you reflect on it, you say, yeah, probably have to get that right. So the robotaxi companies all have a different way of saying safety is our #1 priority. And that's a good thing. I mean, Imagine if they said it wasn't. So it's good they're saying this, but how you measure that and how do you know you got there? That's the tricky part. So what happened in 2023? Because before then, everyone was promising a robotaxi utopia, self-driving car utopia. Surely these will inevitably be safer than human drivers. And what we saw in early 2023, both Waymo and Cruise hit 1 million miles with no driver. Waymo published a detailed safety report at first and is published at this point 3, I think. And Cruise came out with one as well. Waymo said that they reached 1 million rider-only miles in January 2023. And Cruise came out with a report later, and both of them claimed that they were safer than human drivers. But both of them had methodological issues, or at least some people would say that. For example, they only emphasized at-fault crash. And for Cruise in particular, there was a crash where it was pretty clear. It was making a left turn in front of oncoming traffic, stopped in front of the on traffic, got hit. I mean, that was kind of, and they said, nah, I'd say the guy's fault. Well, not entirely, but they didn't count that as their fault. So there's a lot of questions asked about these kind of data reports, but what they're claiming is they have a lower crash rate, they have a lower injury rate, and because of that, they're predicting a lower fatality rate. Now, the fact is they don't have enough miles to know how fatalities are going to turn out, but that's where we are for today. So that was in early 2023. By July 2023, we had reached peak robotaxi hype, where Cruise took out this full-page ad saying humans are terrible drivers, and presumably people killed all 42,795. The reality is a lot more complicated than that. And our cars had 92% fewer collisions, where we're the primary contributor, meaning we don't count the ones where we're less than 50%. And they never drive distracted, drowsy, drunk. Therefore, unsaid, therefore, if everyone rode in a Cruise, no one would die. That's not true. And I think if pressed, they would have to admit that's not true. But that's certainly the marketing message that was put out. Now, the thing to take away is the industry as a whole, not just Cruise, the industry as a whole has been selling our robots don't make stupid mistakes, therefore we're going to be safe. That's clearly the intended takeaway. Then we saw what started happening on city streets. One of the things that people had been saying for years was these robotaxis have LiDARs and they have radars and they have cameras and there's many of them and we have computers and there's no way it would hit a bus or something because it would see the bus and it wouldn't hit it. It wouldn't know that. And then in March 2023, a Cruise robotaxi hit a bus. And you ask, why did it hit the bus? Surely there must have been something bizarre, some unforeseen. Nope, not really. The bus was there and it saw it. Now, there was something unforeseen, but it wasn't that it didn't see the bus. It knew that piece of bus was there. This was an articulated bus, one that bends in the middle because it's extra long. And they apparently had trained it on regular 40-foot buses and not these extended length buses. And so it saw the front half of the bus and decided to follow the front half and ignore the back half and ran into it. Straight up software defect. How do we know it's a software defect? They did a recall, and recalls are for defects. Then in August 2023, we had a robotaxi drive into wet concrete, get mired up to its axles. Pretty clearly marked construction area with construction books and cones and everything. Drove right in, got stuck. Now, if you look on YouTube and you search for cars driving into wet concrete, this is not the only time that's happened, but it happened to Cruise. And then they ran out into the middle of the street. There was an oncoming fire truck and it had its horns going and its sirens going and its lights going, full on emergency response mode. The fire truck had a red light. The robotaxi had a green light. But what happened was the robotaxi said, oh, I've got a green light, and it drove out in front of a fire truck, got hit, failing to yield right of way to an emergency vehicle as required. That one had a passenger injury. Now, the thing about this that's important is human drivers make all these mistakes. There's no question that these are all things humans drivers do, and it's not just once. It happens on a somewhat regular basis, depending on which type of mishap you're talking about. So that's not the point here. The point is we were promised that robotaxis wouldn't drive stupid. And what we're seeing is a little bit different than that. So this really hurt the industry because they had put out an unreasonable expectation. If you say, we're never going to make stupid mistakes, and by the way, we're going to save lives, and it's 100 million miles to save lives, and guess what? You only have 7 million. There's only downside to that promise because every time you make a silly mistake or a dangerous one, you're going to be in the newspaper. And you're not going to be in the newspaper for saving lives because you're years away from that. So this is, in my opinion, a really big strategic messaging mistake the industry made. Then they had issues in the city of San Francisco with first responders that they were interfering with firefighters and ambulances. And it was both Cruise and Waymo. It wasn't just one company. Both of them had these issues. And that's the kind of thing that people hadn't really foreseen. That was just something that never really occurred to me till it started happening. And I've thought a lot about this. But then once it happened, it's like, this is interesting because they're not crashing into anything. And all the data you saw from the previous bar charts and stuff was all, well, we have fewer crashes. Well, there's more to safety than crashes. Running over a charged fire hose or getting between firefighters in a burning vehicle so they can't access the burning vehicle or messing with an emergency scene, those all affect, or blocking a fire truck, they all affect public safety, but it's not a crash, it's some other thing. And then by 2023, we had the winter of discontent, I'll call it. And in October 2nd, a human-driven vehicle hit a pedestrian, and that pedestrian was then pushed, deflected, pick a word you like, into the path of a cruise vehicle who ran the pedestrian over. Now, if that had been all that happened, the industry could have said, well, there's nothing we could have done. It turns out that the external investigation later showed that the robotaxi could have stopped in time, but didn't react to the person in front of it. So there's a lot more there. I have a paper that came out, a preprint that came out that goes into gory detail on this. But the thing that was an issue was the Cruise robotaxi dragged the person after the initial emergency stop. That was the problem because the Cruise robotaxi came to a stop, and instead of phoning home to get additional info, from the operators, just decided to pull to the side of the road and drag this poor woman down the street. To make it worse, rather than coming clean, Cruise did what amounts to a cover-up. The degree and intent is disputed, but the takeaway was that the regulators felt that Cruise had not been forthcoming with them, and Cruise got their permit suspended. So we went from peak robotaxi hype to a really bad mishap, and this hurt the whole industry. So let's get to the core question. Are robotaxis safer? Well, nobody really knows when they'll be safer than human drivers. No one knows the answer to that question. The press releases overstate the company's study results, and the study have limits. They only consider at-fault crashes for these studies, most of them, and they use a ride-hail driver baseline sometimes, so they're comparing themselves to young males in leased vehicles, and saying that makes them safer than other drivers. Well, if you're selling robotaxis, maybe, but it gets messaged as compared to the general population, which is not what's really going on. And the companies are basically saying we're saving lives here, and it's far too early to do that. The reality is that a fatality, to establish that you have fewer fatalities, you're going to take between 300 million miles and 1 billion miles. Now, let me break down why that is. The issue is a ballpark fatality rate is 1 fatality per 100 million miles in the US. And to get statistical significance, you need 300 million miles with no fatalities to prove that your mean time to fatality is 100 million miles ballpark with 95% confidence. And if you have a crash, a fatality in 300 million miles, that is kind of likely because that's 3 times longer than what you're claiming, you end up with like 1 billion miles before you can really make a claim as to how it turned out. Well, these companies have between 5 and 8 million miles. So, 292 million miles to go before they can really make the claim. Now, they're making claims about lower crash rates, and they have some models that extrapolate from that they will have fewer fatalities. And maybe the models are correct, maybe they're not. But we're still in a situation where nobody really knows how it turns out. People who say they know how it's going to turn out are believing their models, and they're aspirational, and I certainly hope they turn out safer, but no one really knows the answer yet. So if you want to declare a safety victory, it's sort of like saying, well, I'm running a marathon and I'm a mile and a half in, and my splits look like I'm going to break the world record. Give me my medal. Is We're not there yet. A lot of things can happen in the rest of the marathon, and that's kind of where the robotaxi industry is. So we hope that they end up safer. The data is within the band that it could be that they end up safer, but it's going to be a long time before we really know how that turns out. So what this means from a policy point of view is we should not be setting policies assuming it is necessarily true there will be safer, because it may turn out the other way. So we should be a little more careful with this technology on the road to make sure if the answers turn out to be it's not quite ready yet, that we have not put lives at risk needlessly, and we've not made trade-offs that harm the safety of the general public to encourage technology that we don't really know how it's going to turn out. Now, let me turn to sort of the other part of my talk, which is, what does safety even mean? Here's an incident in which a robotaxi went into a construction zone, and there was a road. The white sign in the middle you can't really see is a road closed sign, and there's no turn signs, and there's a flag person there and a construction vest, but they had left one lane open on the far side, and one can speculate it was for construction vehicles or something like that. But any human driver would say, I'm not supposed to go there, and the robotaxi went for it anyway. And we could have an interesting discussion about why that might have happened. I have some theories, but no one really knows why. Because nobody got hurt, so there was no mishap report, and it doesn't count for the statistics. But does that make it safe? I'm going to say, probably not. It makes it lucky. It doesn't make it safe, and those are two different things. So, what do you mean by safe? Is it statistical parity with human drivers? That 100 million miles includes all the drunks, by the way. It's more than that. And so there are 7 things I'm going to go through in order. So you're going to see a slide on each one of these 7, and we'll come back and wrap it up. But it's a complicated question. It's much more than, are you safer than a human driver, if you even know what that means. So let's go with that. Positive risk balance. I'm safer than a human driver. Okay, which human driver? Are you going to include the drunk drivers? Are you going to include the drivers who are traveling too fast for conditions? Are you going to include the distracted drivers? That gets a lot of press for being the #1 problem. At a fatality level, it's only like a 99% problem. There's more grit to that discussion, but there are all these issues. And are you going to include them in the pool? Is that okay? Maybe yes, maybe no. Interesting discussion. I will point out that I'm in the prime of my driving career for safety, believe it or not, because I'm 3.5 times better than a 16-year-old. It turns out that once you hit middle age, you lose your twitch reflexes, but you get safer. And the takeaway, that's all data, well-established data. My hypothesis for that is that driving smart does better than driving fast with quick reflexes. And so if you say these cars have quick reflexes, but they don't have good common sense, that suggests they won't be as good as a middle-aged driver. So there's a question in there that remains to be answered. So which driver? Are we going to take out the 16-year-olds who've had a few beers, or are we going to leave them in the pool and we say which human driver we're comparing to? And the what, where also matters. It turns out per vehicle mile traveled in the US, there's a 3.4 times difference in fatalities per 100 million miles. So if you're in a safe state and you're comparing yourself to the national average, you're actually you're giving yourself an unfair advantage. You could be just as safe as the average car in a safe state in some place like Massachusetts and be twice as dangerous as the other drivers in Massachusetts. They happen to be the state with the best numbers right now. And what if you had half the number of fatalities, but there were twice as many pedestrians? Is that going to be okay? We're going to get to that one. Who gets hurt or killed actually kind of matters too. And which vehicle? The average car age in the US is 12.5 years right now. And a 12.5-year car, which, by the way, that means a lot of them are more like 20. Those cars don't have automatic emergency braking. They don't have the fancy high-end airbags. They don't have a lot of the safety equipment. So is it fair to compare your new car to a 12.5-year-old car? The answer is no. And you see this not only in robotaxis, but a lot of the automated driving systems, the so-called self-driving systems, they're comparing themselves to 12.5-year-old cars and saying they're safer. Well, it has nothing to do with the steering automation. It has to do with the fact that they're new cars. You have to avoid risk transfer. What if children are at greater risk, or disabled pedestrians or bicyclists? If there's an identifiable demographic who has greater loss rates with the automation, that's going to be a problem. Now, I will caution you, this story is contested as to how accurate it is. So I'm not showing this as a true story, and that's why I say a caution, it's controversial, but it illustrates something that matters. If it were true that some robotaxi was driving around that had trouble seeing children and therefore would be more likely to hit children, that would be a huge deal. And why do I say this? Well, it illustrates that if you save lives on average, but some especially vulnerable demographic has more risk, that's not going to be okay. So it isn't just you have to save lives on average. It's that you're not going to be able to have any vulnerable group for sure, but maybe even any identifiable group that is put at additional risk. Now, way back when airbags first came out, they found out that women and children were being harmed, were being hurt by the airbags at a disproportionately high rate, and they tracked it down. This is the simple version of the story, that they used male crash test dummies, and women or children tend to be smaller. So they changed the airbag technology to have staged airbags, and there's a whole story there. But the fact that women were being hurt disproportionately more than offset the media and the publicity and the public attitude towards airbags are saving lives. Yeah, but you're actually making it worse for some group. That's going to be a problem. Same thing for robotaxis. You need to avoid negligent driving. So yeah, I apologize that I'm going to get into some legal stuff. I actually have an article in a law journal. I never thought that would happen, but here I am working with lawyers because this matters. The legal situation for this technology is pretty fraught and really unresolved. So let me explain what negligence is and why it matters here. Negligence means that, well, first we need to establish a duty of care to other road users. What does that mean? When you as a human driver go on the road, you have an obligation to look after the safety of other road users. If there's a pedestrian in the middle of the road, you're supposed to do everything you can to avoid hitting them, whether they're in a crosswalk or not, right? So you have a duty of care to not hit things, to not cause damage to other things or harm to other people. And then you ask, was a loss event approximately caused by a breach of this duty of care? And so I'm going to say, well, how should we judge a robotaxi? We should look at the robotaxi and say, would a human driver have been negligent? And if a human driver would have been negligent, that they disregarded their duty of care, a robotaxi or maybe even a driving automation system should similarly be considered negligent. Now, the thing that gets tricky here is statistical safety arguments are not relevant. Safe drivers don't get free passes to run red lights. There's not a situation in which you say, oh, well, I have 1 million miles that I've never gotten a ticket. I've never had a crash. So I'm allowed to run through red lights, even though everyone else has to stop. I mean, that sounds sort of odd when I say it, right? But what that means is the fact that you're statistically safer does not exempt you from the other rules. So if you say, well, now here's another one, and to be clear, this is theoretical. I'm a robotaxi company. My fatality rate is half the number of fatalities as other road drivers. So if I get in a crash where I'm driving the wrong way on a street and I slam head onto another car and kill someone, I should get a free pass because I'm making the roads a safer place. Negligence doesn't work that way. You don't get free passes based on statistical safety. Every crash, every piece of harm is judged as were you being a reasonable person? Were you being a reasonable driver? Were you honoring your duty of care to other drivers? So in the October 2nd cruise mishap, I would say the robotaxi arguably should have been more cautious approaching the scene of the crash with the other car. It accelerated into a pedestrian that was in the crosswalk, which doesn't seem compatible with California rules of the road. But once it had actually seen that pedestrian hit, it probably should have stopped. And for sure, if it hit a pedestrian and couldn't find the pedestrian, so what they said was, well, there was a collision with something, we're not sure what, and then we didn't know what it was, so we pulled to the side of the road. A human driver would have said, I just hit something and I just saw a pedestrian get hit in the lane next to me, I think I'm going to get out of my car and see what's going on before I drive to the side of the road. So those are the kind of behaviors that matter. And this isn't about if you want to say that that crash was unavoidable, but what happened was afterwards was avoidable. It didn't have to move the car after it knew that there had been some mishap, something bad had happened. So that isn't about how often it crashes. That's about duty of care to other road users. The next one is standards. Will set an expectation of safety. And so I'm going to go through some numbers and letter combinations, and I'm going to blow by them pretty quick. It's, there's like a whole nother talk I could do on this, but there are standards out there. There's basic vehicle function standards, FMVSS. This is in the U.S. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard. That's the thing that tells you that the tire pressure warning has to work, and your headlights have to work, and your brakes have to work, and things like this. There's NCAP, New Car Assessment Program, so that's crash test, the star rating system. There's cybersecurity standard, SAE 21434 is the newer one. There's functional safety, ISO 26262. So all of these can apply to all cars. It has nothing to do with automation beyond electronic fuel control and things like this. And that does equipment faults. There's ISO 21448 in some work in Europe for edge cases in the environment, and that also applies to driver systems that do lane centering and things like this that are not fully autonomous. And there's ANSI UL 4600, which actually tells you all the things you need to consider to form a safety case that an autonomous system like a robotaxi is actually as safe as it needs to be. And there's also a road testing safety standard, SAJ 3018, which tells you how to run your safety drivers to make sure they're not overworked and things like this. Some of that was lessons learned from the Uber fatality that happened several years ago. Now, here's the question. Here's a pop quiz. How many of these are required for a car in North America? I can answer for US. I believe it's the same in Canada. How many of these standards are actually required? Just those two. In NCAP, you're required to do it and you get a star rating, but you're not required to be perfect. The rest of them are entirely optional, and good luck finding a car company that will publicly say they conform to any of them. Some of the suppliers do ISO 26262, and they're starting to do 21434. But the robotaxi companies, some of them have actively said, oh, yeah, these standards don't apply to us for reasons. So we have all these industry standards out there, but the companies are not necessarily following them. And in some cases, it really shows. So what's the next one? Fine-grained risks and regulators. You want to avoid regulatory recalls. Now, regulatory recalls are kind of interesting because the fact you had a recall does not make you a bad company. Nobody's perfect. Mistakes will be made, and the recall process is out there to fix the mistakes. So it's okay if you have a recall as long as the recall was for something you did in good faith and you do a good faith remedy to fix the recall. That's all fine. If it's not done in good faith, that's a different story, but we're not going to go there right now. The thing about recalls, though, is that if you have a lot of recalls, it's seen as a safety problem for your company, and a recall is by definition a safety issue. Recalls only happen if there's a safety defect that produces undue risk, and it's informed by the test-centric standards like FMVSS. But if there's a recall, by definition, it means there was a safety issue that was fixed. That's definitional. Okay, and the thing about recalls is they're not net risk. They're not specific. You're not going to see a recall saying, well, your fatality rate is 10% worse than all the other cars, so we're going to do a recall, because recalls are not about throw it away, build another car. I don't know what you do for 10% more if that's the only thing you have. That's not how recalls work. Recalls are something very specific, such as rolling through stop signs on purpose, such as phantom braking, having too high a rate of braking for no reason and getting rear-ended, such as a malfunctioning display console that has safety critical things on it. So if your malfunction indicators and speedometer are on a tablet in the center and that tablet dies, you're now in violation of safety standards. You will be recalled. So those type of things are recalls, but all of them, it's very difficult, and it's a little tenuous to say, well, the fact you're rolling through stop signs, how many fatalities a year will that result in? That math is not so straightforward, but it is nonetheless something you need to get right for safety, because even if you're net saving 10 times the life, so you have 10% of the fatalities they used to have, but you're blasting through red lights, and all your crashes are because you went through a red light and got hit, hypothetically, right? That's not going to be okay. NHTSA is going to recall you because they're not going to give you credit for the 90% you saved. They're going to say you're going through red lights and getting hit. You need to fix that. So people misunderstand that a recall is going to happen if there's a specific undue risk for a specific behavior, and arguing to net safety improvement really doesn't have a seat at the table there. It's an additional constraint on safety. Now, regulators are still struggling to predict safety outcomes in advance. There's a 2020 proposal, that list of standards I showed you, there's a 2020 proposal from US DOT to require basically all those standards, and it's still gathering dust, so we're going to see how that goes. So right now, the regulators are mostly into the recall game, and there's no type approval, there's no proactive standards in the US. In Europe, there is type approval, but the standard push is still not as strong as it might be. Number 6, ethical and equity concerns. Ride-hailing made a lot of promises. So people were told, oh, yes, if you're not able to drive, ride-hail is there to save you because it'll be a cheaper taxi system and you'll be able to more conveniently get ride and will help. And a lot of those promises didn't really happen. They said, well, ride-hail will reduce congestion. Well, it turns out it increased congestion. Ride-hail will serve folks who, for example, are sight impaired, and it turned out they're the ones yelling the loudest for robotaxis because the ride-hail drivers won't pick them up because of their guide dog. I saw that play out in San Francisco. So there are a lot of equity concerns. What about all the displaced taxi drivers? What about the disabled community? One of the interesting observations is that if you have cheap taxis, it will increase the use of taxis, probably pulling riders away from public transit because of the lower price point. We saw this with ride-hail, and that will decrease road safety because a bus or a train is more than 10 times safer than any car, robotaxi or otherwise. So it actually get a net degradation of public safety by putting robotaxis on the road. And there's some ethical and related concerns. What if you're testing in vulnerable populations? A disproportionate number of the crashes in San Francisco have happened in a place called the Tenderloin, which is a very disadvantaged neighborhood. And it also is very busy from emergency response point of view for related reasons. And they're testing there. And you ask, do you really need to test there? You're having all these crashes and all the people there are really disadvantaged. Maybe you shouldn't be testing there. The long-term aspirational safety risks, safety goals incur some real short-term risk. Some people say, well, I'm saving lives tomorrow, so it's okay to be dangerous today. And other folks have an issue with that kind of reasoning. And the big one here for me, for ethics, is there's no required independent safety oversight. The companies ultimately decide when they want to put the technology on the road. There are some regulations, they're pretty lightweight, and the regulators don't have a lot of visibility into what's really going to happen. And for me, that's actually the ethical issue that matters. Getting close to the end. So sustainable trust is my number 7. Back when Argo was operating, they had their safety report said it's a matter of trust, and they're absolutely right. This all boils down to trust. And what you've seen recently is a degradation of trust for a number of reasons. I would argue a lot of that is self-inflicted by the industry, but here we are. Saying robotaxis won't make stupid driving mistakes, followed by, that just guarantees every newspaper is going to run every picture of a stupid robotaxi they can find. That's a self-inflicted wound on the industry. And the relentless blame of human drivers. Drivers are terrible. Come use our robotaxis are here to save you. Again, every time a robotaxi makes a mistake, that's going to blow back in their face. That was just a path they shouldn't have taken. It's not too late for the companies to change paths and come up with a more enlightened, enlightened self-interest is the term, right? They should take that path in their rhetoric, but they aren't. They're doubling down on these messages, and it's not working for them. There's trust degrading tactics. For example, I mentioned municipal preemption. I skipped on our previous slide, but basically San Francisco does not have a say. They're not allowed to interfere with robotaxis at all. The state completely overrides them the same way they overrid the cities for ride-hail. And the city is really frustrated because it's really causing a lot of problems for the city, and the city has no say. They testify at the state hearings, and the state hearings do favor the companies. The city's not getting what it needs. And the companies are also redacting and withholding crash information. A lot of times it's just, it makes no sense. It's not proprietary. They just want to, apparently just want to reduce the amount of information they give to the bare minimum they can get away with. And these things degrade trust. So when you hear, for example, in the Cruise case, they sent not one, but two reports that were made public that omitted the pedestrian dragging part. And later on, they had to admit it on the 30-day notice after the 1-day notice and the 10-day notice omitted it. That makes them look pretty non-trustworthy. And if you have a company that looks non-trustworthy, the next time a bad thing happens, people are not going to really want to believe their side of the story, even if it was not their fault. So I think it's important for the industry to increase trust. Some of the things they can do are talk with, not at stakeholders. That was a comment from San Francisco emergency responders saying that companies would talk at them instead of listening to what their concerns were. I think they need more transparency on the incidents and corrective actions. I think they need to accept a proportional responsibility for loss events. Instead of saying, what was 49% our fault, so that counts as zero, they should say, yeah, that was 49% our fault, but you should still have some faith in us because here are all the things we did to make sure that was fixed and it'll never happen again. And you're not hearing that second part of the conversation from these companies. And they need to start acting that way if they want trust. And I would like them to see supporting release criteria in advance. So right now they're saying we're operating on the roads. Come back in a year, we'll let you know how it turned out. Oh, look, it turned out great if you look at the metrics the way we want you to look at them. That's not particularly trust-inspiring. Something more trustworthy would be, here's our month-by-month projection on how many cars and how many fender benders and how many other things, and we're going to tell you how it turned out. And if we're above target, we're going to tell you how we changed our things to be safer. And if we're worse, and if we're better, well, that's great. Everyone's happy. But you're not seeing that sort of dialogue. You're seeing the maximum possible suppression of information because they can get away with it right now. So wrapping up, lessons for AV industry success. Hopefully I've convinced you that if they say they're net better than a human driver, they left a lot of stuff on the table that they're going to have to address whether they want to or not. They need to make sure they don't risk transfer onto vulnerable populations, because when that becomes appreciated, it's going to be a problem. They are not allowed to negligently drive, even if they're statistically better, and they should be held to the same standards as human drivers. Not perfection, just the same standards as human drivers. They should conform to industry safety standards. So something I want to add there is, the reason is we won't know for a billion miles how it turns out. So how can you build trust and assurance and confidence in all the stakeholders that they're probably on the right path? Well, you could conform to your own industry safety standards like airplanes do and chemical plants and pretty much every other industry, but the car industry doesn't do that. You need to avoid regulatory recalls because those are by definition safety issues and they generate bad press. There's some ethical and equity concerns that are hard to measure, but if you make negative externalities onto public safety, expect that to be in the news, expect the cities to complain, and that's exactly how it turned out. And in the end, you need to build sustainable trust, and rhetoric doesn't get you there because actions speak louder than words. And with that, I'm happy to enter the Q&A and take questions. Thank you.
Wow, wow, thank you very much. Talk about a lot to unpack and a lot to digest. I'm going to be watching this recording myself, probably more than once, because there's just so much to digest. It was
that was the fire hose version, yeah.
yeah, I know, and I'm at that certain point in life too, where the processor isn't quite up to speed. I need to slow things down a bit, but that was fantastic. Thank you very much. And talking about my processor not working, I neglected to say at the outset and invite everybody watching to, by all means, enter some questions for Phil into the Q&A, and we're going to work on those for the next 20 minutes or so. So if there's anything that that comes to mind that you would like to ask, this is your time to do it. You can just jump in there on the Q&A. We have one of my co-partners here, Jason Arnaud, who's with EV Society. He's going to be monitoring the Q&A and reading out some of those questions. So I'll get him to jump on. I do have one quick question, and it's a quick one, not the one we talked about in the setup.
Now you're just taunting everyone by not telling them what it was, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's what we do, right? But I'm curious, some of the issues that you raised, certainly not all of them, could they not be mitigated at least somewhat by the fact that in the case of one autonomous company, or that's trying to become autonomous, where they have basically a mirror or two self-driving chips in the system, one doing the work and the other one monitoring what the driver's doing, so that it can compare. This is what the software would have done in this situation, but the human did this and it caused an accident. Is that kind of comparative information useful for at least some of the issues that you've raised?
They do it a different way. What they have is a lot of simulations, a huge amount of simulation. And if they see something anomalous on a drive, they'll put it in their simulation. And then before they deploy new software, they'll run all of it through the simulation to see if it did the wrong thing. So what you're talking about, doing the comparison is one way to train these systems, but there are other ways. But the problem is if you don't have the human driver, the second system doesn't do you any good because there's no human driver to compare against. So I would say a lot of the issues we're seeing are because they decided to take the human driver out of the vehicle before it was really fully baked. And if they had a test driver there, they certainly could do that if they wanted. There's a bunch of ways to do it. But it comes down to when you take the test driver out, you're not testing anymore, you're deployed.
Right.
And calling it testing is simply sort of a ruse to say, well, we're still testing, so what do you expect? Like, well, I expect you not to put other road users who did not consent to be human subjects in the experiment at risk. That's what I expect.
Right, right. No, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. Jason, do we have some questions that we can put on the table here?
We certainly do, Tim, and more are coming in, so I will get started. First question is, seems that we need to have a much better understanding of all of the subtle and not at all obvious automatic or muscle memory abilities of human drivers in threatening or situational awareness related situations before we can get a handle on everything that an automated system needs to address. Is there or are there any studies being done on human factors in this area to help with this?
There are a ton of human factor studies. They're mostly about driver takeover from automation and the human computer pairing that you see in so-called level 2 systems in the Teslas and in autopilot and Super Cruise and Blue Cruise and those kind of things. In terms of the muscle memory, my experience suggests that that's only part of the problem, because all the companies now are pretty sophisticated. They look at all the crashes that are common and they make sure they can handle the crashes. The things that they have trouble with are two things. One is the really rare edge cases that happen so rarely, they've never seen them in testing. And people are not perfect at those, but they're pretty good at those. And I would submit, I mentioned that older drivers are safer than younger drivers, but younger drivers unquestionably have better reflexes, right? So it's partly the muscle memory training, perhaps, but I think some of it is also the older drivers are better at sniffing out a dangerous situation and not getting themselves into needing the quick reflexes in the first place. So one anecdote from San Francisco is the firefighters were saying they're seeing a lot of robotaxis coming on fire scenes. And they pointed out that a human driver seeing a massive structure fire three blocks away is probably not going to drive in among the fire trucks and try and thread the needle that way. They're probably going to go around, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing that a 16-year-old's bad at and a 50-year-old's good at. So some of it is not just muscle memory, but also real-world experience and maturity of judgment. So I think you need both those things.
Thank you. Obviously, we're going to get a lot of Tesla FSD questions.
Sure,
so
bring them on.
I'll combine two. How does Tesla's FSD fit into this world, and will their large amount of driving data help with cracking the nut that is full autonomy?
Well, they have a lot of driving data, but then again, so do the robotaxi companies. Theirs comes from simulation. Tesla comes from sampling, because my understanding is they don't get all the driving data. They just get the data they go out and sample, which is a little different. Actually, it's a lot different. They don't have every single mile a Tesla ever drove, because who would pay the internet bill for that? So you have to keep that in mind. And, more data at some point has diminishing utility. It's how smart you are using the data. So arguing they have more data, so they're going to win is an interesting intellectual argument, but we're not seeing Teslas running around without safety drivers, yet. Tesla's official story is they're at level 2, which means there has to be a driver in the vehicle. They're also of the opinion they've told California that it's not a test bed for autonomy because they would have to have a permit for that. I know they've announced the robotaxi real soon now for the whatever anniversary it is of that promise. So we're going to see, can they pull it off? Who knows, right? But what we're seeing is other companies are actually operating robotaxis on real roads, and I may have some issues with their approach to safety, but they're out there and they're operating, right here, right now, today. So you have to say that their approach is also reaping benefits.
That segues nicely to one of my own questions. Obviously, there's a big debate around the morality, for lack of a better term, of testing autonomous vehicles on public roads, and people say that they should be on test tracks until they are perfectly safe. Where do you fall on that? Is it practical? Is it not practical? Which way should people be going?
So I sympathize with that sentiment. I have a somewhat more nuanced approach, but I think it's compatible. I think that the test driver should not be removed until they're sure that they are no more dangerous than a human driver. And I just explained why that's complicated, but that's got to be the minimum bar. And in fact, the test drivers have been removed based on a prediction based on very, very low confidence in a statistical sense data, saying, yeah, we think we're good. We're going to pull out the safety driver. There's no scientific merit to pulling out the safety driver. You could leave the safety driver in, because if the safety driver goes for 100 million miles and never touches the controls, that is no different than operating 100 million miles without the safety driver. There's, if they're not intervening, they're not intervening, but they're there to, for example, know there's a pedestrian under the car and avoid driving with a pedestrian under the car. And what we're seeing is these companies are having a lot of trouble with edge cases. Waymo was in the news 2 or 3 times in the past week for driving the wrong way down a street. In some of them were clearly, yes, maybe an impaired human driver would have done that, but it was pretty clear that it was a bad judgment call on the car. And a test driver could have stopped that. All the problems we're seeing, the vast majority, if a test driver had been in the car, we would not have seen the bad thing. So I would say the test driver should be there until the technology is mature. And it isn't like these companies don't have billions of dollars. I don't think the cost of the test driver is a thing. I think it's that they want the optic as a look, ma, no driver. So once they're safe, sure, pull the test driver out. But the other thing is you don't have to be on a test track. Statistically, there's not a lot of detailed analysis, but looking at how the numbers sort of stack up, it looks like trained professional employee of a company test drivers are coming out about the same as human-driven cars. So if you can make that argument with a little bit more rigor, I think it's not irresponsible to be doing public road testing as long as you can show that your test drivers are such good drivers that they can compensate for the vagaries of the robotaxi. Now, what we are seeing is a lot of question with the partially automated vehicles, where the features may be maybe test versions, or maybe have defects and be recalled for defects. And you're asking retail customers to cosplay as test drivers, and they're not trained. There's not even qualification theater anymore. It's just, go ahead, you'll be fine. And what they're finding is this technology has some systemic issues that we saw in this recent recall stuff. And a lot of these drivers are not prepared or able to compensate for them for a variety of reasons. And so in my mind, that's really kind of what's dangerous, is putting not ready for prime time software out there and expecting retail customers to play test driver when they're not qualified.
Thanks. I have 2 other related questions. I'll start with the shorter one. What's the real reason for autonomous vehicles? Is it the betterment of society, or is it just, to further technology?
Well, it's certainly shiny. There's no question about that. And For a while, the mantra was these will never make stupid mistakes. You know, the only for a long time ago when it started, people would saying the only crashes they will have are going to be where Newtonian mechanics says that, you know, F equals ma means you can't stop in time, right? I heard those arguments like, yes, if the boulder falls out of the sky in front of you, you're going to hit it. I get that, okay? And so they were promising that would be the limit. And you saw the pictures. You know, that's not how it's turning out. These things make mistakes too, because it's very hard for a person to engineer a perfect system, especially with new novel technology. We're still trying to understand how to make safe. So, you know, the safety argument is sort of played out, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. So that's not a compelling moral reason to deploy the technology. Now, for the folks who are saying, but the self-driving type technology, and that's lowercase less, lowercase d, I'm talking about all the companies, will improve safety. Well, the data says that's not happening either. On a good day, it's sort of a wash. It comes out about even, and all the safety you're really seeing is from automatic emergency braking and all these new car safety features. And if you look at the insurance outcomes, the cars with the most aggressive self-driving don't show up in the top 10 for insurance safety claims in terms of how safe they are. So you know, it's self-driving, automated steering. Insurance Institute for Highway Safety recently said very plainly, it's not a safety feature, it's a convenient feature. There's no safety benefit demonstrated. So why do you have it? Well, people like cars to drive themselves. People would prefer to not have a human driver in their ride hail, I guess. You know, the business case for ride hail in particular, it's an interesting discussion, but I'm a safety guy. I'll leave that one for someone else. There is a more compelling case, perhaps, for automated middle mile trucks that go out on highways and drive long distances. There's certainly a case for low speed shuttles. There's been a case, and they've been deployed for mining and agriculture. That stuff's been years, and that makes sense. There's not a lot of people around to get hurt. It's a more controlled environment. There's clear economic benefit. So the technology has benefits. It's a question not of when, but where and what scale and what's the operational concept.
And the second part of that was a great answer, by the way. The second related question is that many, and I'm paraphrasing this a little, many of the promised benefits of AVs are societal rather than corporate benefits. That suggests that societal oversight is necessary to validate that the technology is delivering as expected. Is there a precedent for this kind of societal oversight in another setting or industry?
That's, you know, in a capitalist society, that's an unusual thing to have, right? Medicine, medical care, we're sort of seeing that push, right? But I would go another way in that you can't expect private capital to have as its sole interest public safety. I mean, somebody says, oh, I'm going to sell you some stock, you're going to lose money, but it benefits public safety. I'm going to say your market cap's going to be kind of limited on that sale, right? That's not how it works. And I'm okay with capitalists, and I'm okay with investors making money. That's great. But let's be honest and say you're in it to make money. And take a more enlightened self-interest approach, which I mentioned earlier, which is we're in it to make money. We know that we won't make money if we're unsafe. So we're motivated to have acceptable safety society to make money. But saying we're going to be, you know, we're going to save 10 times the lives or whatever the number is, you know, that's just a ridiculous promise that won't happen. Instead, say, we're here to make money. Yep. We're here to make your life better these 5 ways. Here's the metrics. Here's how we can show we're actually delivering on the metrics. And here's why we're responsible players that despite the fact we'll lose money if we slow down, you know, here's how you know you can trust us to not deploy before we're ready. That kind of messaging, I think, would go a lot further than never mind that crash, we're busy saving lives here, go away, which is kind of the industry attitude right now.
Okay, Tim, can I squeeze in one more?
By all means.
Comment from Stephen talks about driving with Tesla FSD. He says, I view it as having 2 imperfect drivers in the vehicle, myself being one. However, I think 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and feel that FSD increases my safety. Am I deluding myself?
There's actually a study that shows using this technology that people think they're safer and objectively they're not. So there actually is a psychological basis for that question that some studies support saying you feel better about it. You feel more rested and you're actually not. So that was an interesting study, but not conclusive to be sure. The thing about the two eyes, for anyone who's a parent and had to sit in the passenger seat while their kid was learning how to drive, might argue that's more stressful than having a single driver, right? And so the issue is, if the technology is very predictable in how it fails, and it fails often enough that you remain attentive, maybe it's okay. But there are two issues. One is if you have unpredictable failures, then you learn to overtrust it, and you're not ready to react when it makes some completely unpredictable failure. It goes by some obstacle 100 times in a row, and the 101st it veers in and tries to kill you. You're not going to be ready for that 101st. And this actually describes some of the mishaps we've seen. But the other one is people are wired for complacency. If there's a system that is somewhat reliable, they learn to trust it several orders of magnitude faster than they really should. And people are just wired this way. If something isn't a threat for 10 times or 20 times, you're not even paying attention by the 21st. And at 1 per 100 million, those aren't the odds you need to stay safe. So it's pretty well documented that people have a lot of trouble paying attention and take a long time to re-engage. And that length of time is much longer than the reaction time you need. As an example, and this I'll wrap up here, but there have been multiple fatalities where a driver sort of tuned out. They engaged automation and stopped paying attention when they should have been. And one of them happened less than 10 seconds after automation was engaged. So this feeling, I look up every once in a while, we're fine. It's like, that a lot can change in less than 10 seconds, and people just aren't wired to be that way.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone that submitted questions.
Thanks for the questions. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason. And thanks, Phil. I'm going to have to rethink. I am a full self-driving supervisor now, they call us. And I guess I need to rethink a little bit, pay a little more attention if I can. But I'm hoping there's maybe also a little bit of negative bias in some of what you've described, because we don't count all the interventions that prevented an accident. We kind of only look at the other side of that coin for the most part.
Well, so the thing is, safety isn't about the good days. Safety is about the bad days, right?
Yeah.
And the statistic, so again, to be clear, the statistics do not show a safety benefit from the technology. I didn't say it was dangerous. I just said it failed to show a safety benefit.
Got it.
But there are also systematic weaknesses. And if you're not paying attention to one of those systematic weaknesses, you're going to have a bad day. So I think that's the way to look at it.
Yeah. We won't even get into the trolley concerns.
That's
I know. I know. We're going into philosophy now, and we don't need to go there. I've got 1 minute. If we can, I'm really curious to know. 25 years you've been at this. How did you get involved in this area?
Oh, but by chance. So in 1995, Carnegie Mellon went across the United States, 98% hands off the wheel with a self-steering car. 98%, right? Yeah, 1995. And as all the alums of that program say, ever since we've been working on that last 2%. And a couple of years after that, they're like, maybe we should do safety, do you think? And so they hired me onto the team, and that's how I got involved.
Cool. Very cool. Well, listen, I can't thank you enough. It's it's really enlightening. It's given, as I said earlier, a ton of food for thought. It's kind of don't want to set aside so many important safety issues, and you certainly raised some that hadn't occurred to me. And I think everybody watching is going to appreciate the information you've shared and the thought process that you've spurred on here, and appreciate your time so much.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. Thank you. So let me say that next month on Canada Talks Electric Cars, we'll be joined by Raymond Lurie, President of the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa, also known as EVCO, to take a deep look at how electrifying transportation aids our efforts to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change. Remember to mark the date. It's Tuesday, June 4th, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. On behalf of all of us at EV Society, we thank you for joining us today and for asking so many terrific questions. This will conclude today's webinar.